Today we're in Georgetown, a neighborhood in Washington, D.C. I'm Nick Potts, an architect, and we're going to be doing a walking tour of the neighborhood. Georgetown predated Washington, D.C. It was founded in 1751 as its own independent port city and didn't become incorporated until the later 19th century when D.C. started growing. We're going to start off on P Street between 30 and 31st Street in front of a row of federal townhouses. This row of townhouses behind me is probably one of the most quintessential rows of townhouses in all of Georgetown. They date from the early 19th century. They're 3 stories with classic simple brick detailing. So the 2 buildings on the right with the gas lamp, those would be a little more what you would call federal style. They're simpler, they're most likely earlier than the ones on the left. You can see a little bit more ornament evolving. It's federal, it's simpler in detailing. Generally, if it's a little more ornate, it's what you would call Georgian. There's always been a little bit of conservatism to how Georgetown was built, particularly in terms of the housing styles. This area would have been built before the bureaucratic center of Washington, D.C. spread to this area, which is why the houses are tighter together. These were row houses versus more freestanding villas, and this is really about fitting into and being part of a community. Because row houses occupy the entire street front, the builders needed to find a way of getting people in and goods into the backyards without moving through the main house. One of the ways to do that was to create a second entrance immediately adjacent to the door that allows someone to get to the backyard without trudging through the house. Right now we're in Georgetown near Dumbarton Oaks. The house behind me shows residential architecture at its most eclectic in the late 19th century, which is something fairly unusual for Georgetown. Typically Georgetown houses are these restrained federal and Georgian style houses, and this one is kind of the complete opposite. It's a combination of revival styles, a little bit of Queen Anne, a little bit of colonial revival, and even though the building is made of brick, there are some elements like the painting of the windows that are very clearly influenced by other movements like the shingle style and the work that people like H.H. Richardson and McKimby and White were doing. So right after the centennial, we're looking back towards our historical precedent and borrowing little bits and pieces of building styles from the past and collaging them into something totally new and different. The shingle style was a style that developed in a lot of vacation towns. You see them on the coast in New England, places like Newport. There's a style born out of actually a misinterpretation of a photograph. There was a very famous architectural photograph that was published, taken of an old colonial house. And it was actually the back of the house. It was a house in Newport and a salt box house. And that photograph became its own style as the media kind of replicated this image and architects saw it. It fueled the imaginations of architects who were looking at history and trying to find a truly American style. So clearly this isn't a shingle style house, but it's taking little bits and pieces from that style, which was happening during the same period when this was being built. So the colonial revival elements you see here are the brackets at the top of the cornice and the painting of the window, like the use of this half-round window, which is looking at colonial style houses, but clearly it's not a colonial style house at all. So there's a little bit of arts and crafts, and you can see that in the window on the second level, that kind of leaded glass window. There's also a little bit of Richardsonian Romanesque with the rusticated stone at the base combined with the brick above it. Now the tower, that's a very strong Queen Anne sort of thing. And what's really unique about this house is the fact that it's just freely borrowing and sampling from a lot of the other popular styles that were going on. So now we're in front of the LAIRD-DUNLOP Lincoln House on N Street. This house has a pretty long history, and you can see it in the massing of the house, that it's grown and evolved over time from a single mass to these side wings and service wings. Because the houses here are generally so close to the road, there's not really enough room for a stoop that's perpendicular to the street. They're vertical rise parallel to the street because you can't project out to the road over the sidewalk without crossing into the street. So here's a switchback integrated into the stoop. And the dual switchback here is most likely to give it a little more presence and a little more prominence, even though the second stair really isn't necessary. The house was originally designed without an architect. It was a work of an amateur design by William Lovering, though it's still a pretty masterful use of these common materials. You see these arch windows. There's some really interesting brickwork where the brick tracks over the tops of the arches and becomes a band course. So it's really a pretty well done amateur work of architecture for a Federalist building. So the idea of an architect really didn't exist in the way that it does now. A lot of the times builders were the people who are designing the buildings, but here there's someone who's designing it who's not really a builder, but isn't trained in the same kind of formal sense of having gone to an architecture school. This house, interestingly, like a lot of these houses in Georgetown, was owned by some famous names. In particular, Robert Todd Lincoln, who was Abraham Lincoln's son, and more recently, it was the house of Benjamin Bradley, who was the notable editor of the Washington Post. So if you're buying a house in Georgetown, essentially, you're the caretaker of it, and you've probably shared it with some other notable names. Right now we're on the corner of 28th Street and Q in Georgetown. And this is one of two identical houses that were built within the same 2 blocks, which was based on a plan published by Andrew Jackson Downing. Downing is one of the first architects in the United States who started publishing books of architectural plans. And this was an incredibly influential book called The Architecture of Country Houses. Originally, both of these houses, this one and its twin at 30th and Q, were both Italianate villas. So they both had a central tower with brackets, a small porch with arch windows, and a fairly low roof line. Interestingly, both of these houses have gone through really dramatic changes. The one at 28th and Q is radically different from what it previously was. The brackets were removed, it had a 2-story porch put on, and it was simplified into something that almost looks like a little more colonial, taking away a lot of the Victorian excesses and making it just more prim and proper than it was originally intended to be. What happened to the tower on this is the thing that always cracks me up about this one, because it was meant to terminate vertically and they ran a cornice right in front of it. They're almost ignoring its existence. On the other hand, this house's twin at 30th and Q was converted into an apartment house in the 1890s. So the main house has maintained a lot more of its main structure, but it's eclipsed by this huge wing that expanded off to the right and extended the language. And the 2-story portico is also a really unusual thing. It almost looks like New Orleans here more than anything else. You see these double height grand porticos down south, but you don't see them here in the Northeast. The house did originally have a porch, but it was a little 1-story affair with arches. So I'm not sure if someone took a trip down south and decided they wanted a big veranda. Right now we're on 31st Street near Tudor Place. Originally, the northern part of Georgetown was, when it was first settled, it was 3 major estates. Tudor Place, which were nearby, Evermay, and the Oaks, which is now Dumbarton Oaks. After the city was absorbed by Washington, D.C., the parcels of these great estates started being parceled up and developed as development sites for new houses. And the houses behind me are kind of show some of the range of some of the unique styles that started to emerge out of that. Even though a lot of the row houses tended to be a bit more kind of strictly federal, these show a bit more trendy styles of buildings. The red building behind us is a really kind of prime example of a shingle style house. And this is a very pure expression of what was going on in the shingle style, which was an interpretation of what in the 19th century, right around the time of the centennial of the country, people thought was kind of the original true American style. And you see little bits and pieces of what would have been colonial buildings. You see spindles that could have been on a staircase. You see very small panes of windows introduced into larger panes. You see grids, you see fretwork, and you see shingles. Next to it is a different interpretation of things that were going on in the 1880s. The building to the right is more of a typical row house that takes advantage of technology, and particularly notable on this one are the pressed bricks that you see in the spandrels and in the pediments of the row house. So even though this would have been a developer building and not something that was kind of at the forefront or built bespoke, it was still trying to personalize itself, like those pyramidal bricks over the 3rd floor balcony and these Louis Sullivan sort of patterns in the bricks are taking some stylistic motifs but using a very kind of common everyday material brick that could be made in a factory. So right now we're in the 2700 block of P Street in front of the narrowest house in Georgetown. Georgetown is really a city of extremes. We've seen a lot of the large elite houses, but on the other side, there's a port town and there was a large worker population. So the very, very compact wood frame houses like this were meant to serve the workers of the ports. And so we end up with these very narrow houses, including this one, which is barely 10 feet wide. So it's essentially the width of a room. And what's been interesting is these were originally intended to be very working class buildings, but clearly they're not anymore. The working class house is almost always wood frame because it's frankly cheaper to build. Because wood is fairly easy to manipulate, there's an ability to introduce simple things like these carved brackets, these things that can be also made in a factory offsite. Particularly when you're getting to the 19th century, there are these catalogs of molding profiles, cornices, shutters, doors, that someone can add at a minimal cost. So these are working class houses, but they're not tenements. And there's an ability for people of modest means to surround themselves, even though their house is small, with the trappings of the middle class. Now we're on Q Street in front of a row of Italianate twin houses. Right now we're immediately after the Civil War. The country is growing, the country is unified again. The capital of the country, which was once divided, is now suddenly relevant, and we have professionals moving to the city, working for the government, wanting to live in a nice neighborhood that's close to the center of government for our newly unified nation. So these houses are interesting because it was a planned development. It's 4 twin houses, so 8 units. They're done by the same developer and the same architect, and they vary, but it's one development and essentially planning an entire street front of the community. We're looking back to France again, and this is similar to some of the French Second Empire buildings that were happening in the monumental core, like the Executive Office building, only taken to the scale of a house. And it's the same motifs, the mansard roofs, the brackets. So each of these houses, it takes a lot of the same elements and reshuffles them. So each of the houses has a tower, and some of them it's at the middle, some of them it's off to one side. The same thing with the brackets. Some of the windows project, some are more flat. So it's trying to hide or almost disguise the fact that this was a kind of a mass development of 8 houses in 4 buildings by kind of breaking them up into their component parts and making them seem a little more different and differentiated. Which makes sense because these were a more luxury house. People wanted to express themselves and not feel like they were buying the same thing that their neighbor was. So right now we're at the C&O Canal and Aqueduct in the southern part of Georgetown, which is immediately south of Main Street. And when it was founded in 1751, Georgetown was a port town. This was because it was the furthest point north on the Potomac where ocean-going vessels could navigate. So what happened was the development of canals, and George Washington was actually a huge proponent of canals. You have to remember this is before railroads, and canals were a way of making unnavigable parts of the country available. So just like the Erie Canal in New York, DC had its own version in the Potomac Canal. So it really was a network of transportation. Already by the 1830s when it was built, the C&O Canal was a money loser. By this point, railroads had already started taking over as the preferred transportation network. But the canal kept going, and it was almost breaking even up until the 1920s when there was a flood and it was essentially abandoned. And so what was left in Georgetown was actually a lot less industry once the canal was no longer functional. And there's a point where stuff was built and there just wasn't enough wealth to demolish it, and that's really why Georgetown in its current state exists. It wasn't quite wealthy enough to tear itself down and reinvent itself. And so what we have now is this very intact 19th century city within the footprint of DC. At this point, there's been a complete inversion, particularly in America, about the value of waterfronts. Essentially, up until recent history, the waterfront was the least desirable place that you'd want to live. It's where the industry was, boats made a lot of noise, and they were really a working environment. And now that we've deindustrialized our waterfronts, this is the first time when this would have been a desirable place to live. And you can really see the change walking around Georgetown with its restaurants, these expensive houses, people eating on the sidewalk, and that sort of idea of the recreational waterfront that didn't previously exist. Georgetown to me is really just a great microcosm of urbanism in America. Even though we think of it as this desirable neighborhood to live, if we look behind the surface, it actually tracks a lot of the trends that existed when our neighborhood started building cities, which is when we started realizing that we need cities rather than just rural farmland. And part of why Georgetown is so unique is that it benefited from the fact that Washington was growing right around the same time that it was declining. In a lot of cities that are declining, you don't have this consumer to move in, and Washington had this ready-made population of people who could come in and do an early version of gentrification, rediscovering this thing that had already been built and turning it into something totally new.